The oak-paneled courtroom was packed, its benches filled with townspeople, reporters, and officers who had followed the trial since day one. The case had already become a local spectacle, drawing attention from newspapers across the state. But on that morning, something happened that no one expected. The doors creaked open, and a small figure entered the chamber, clutching a worn teddy bear. A hush fell over the crowd as a 3-year-old girl was guided by her mother toward the witness stand. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearly startled. Children so young rarely entered such solemn spaces, let alone took the stand. Lawyers glanced at one another, some amused, others visibly concerned. Could a child this young even understand the weight of her words? Yet the air in the courtroom shifted, curiosity replacing routine. Everyone leaned forward, as if sensing the story was about to take an unforgettable turn. The little girl's tiny shoes tapped against the wooden floor, the sound surprisingly loud in the silence. Each step was measured, hesitant, yet determined in a way that only a child's innocence could convey. The teddy bear dangled in her grip like a shield against the sea of unfamiliar faces. Her mother's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, guiding her forward, though the girl seemed less frightened than the adults around her. At the far side of the room sat Rex, the German shepherd at the center of the case. His handler kept a steady hand on the leash, though Rex himself appeared calm, his eyes tracking the small child with quiet intensity. It was almost as if he recognized her, though no one else in the room yet understood why. The tension had been building for weeks. This wasn't an ordinary case. It was a trial about whether a police dog could be held responsible for excessive force during an arrest. The idea was controversial, dividing the town and attracting national commentary. Some argued that a dog was just following training, incapable of guilt. Others claimed accountability was necessary, no matter the form. For days, the proceedings had revolved around technicalities. Commands issued, the suspect's injuries, the handler's actions. But that morning, as the child approached, the argument seemed to vanish into the background. The judge's gavel rapped once, drawing attention back to the bench. "Order," he said firmly, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. His gaze lingered on the little girl, who was now climbing onto the oversized chair of the witness stand. The bailiff rushed to adjust the microphone downward, his large hands fumbling awkwardly with the stand until the device hovered just above her chin. She blinked at it, uncertain, then turned her gaze toward the dog. The moment was surreal. A courtroom built on logic, evidence, and procedure now held its breath for a toddler. Reporters scribbled furiously in notepads, sensing the headline of the decade. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to process what was unfolding. And Rex, steady as stone, remained motionless, his gaze locked on the little girl as though time itself had paused between them. Her mother whispered something into her ear, but the child shook her head stubbornly. She didn't need coaxing. Though her legs dangled far above the ground, she sat upright, her teddy bear still clutched close. The judge cleared his throat. "Young lady, do you know why you're here today?" His tone was unusually gentle, stripped of the authority he had used all week. The girl nodded once, solemnly. Her answer was so soft that only the microphone carried it through the room. "Because of Rex." The single sentence sent ripples through the audience. Reporters lifted their heads. The defense attorney scribbled a note to his colleague. The prosecutor frowned, sensing the unpredictable weight of a child's testimony. For the first time since the trial began, the atmosphere wasn't controlled by adults. This tiny voice now commanded the room. From the back benches, someone coughed nervously. A juror dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. Even the bailiff, a stoic man who had kept order in the courthouse for decades, looked away, as though unwilling to reveal that the sight of the child stirred something deep in him. Meanwhile, Rex remained perfectly still. His ears flicked once, then settled. To the untrained eye, he appeared indifferent, but those familiar with police dogs saw something else, a quiet recognition, an acknowledgement of the girl who had just spoken his name. The judge leaned back, tapping his gavel softly against the bench. He had seen countless witnesses take the stand, hardened criminals, weeping victims, confident experts, but never a child so young, and never in such a charged case. He turned toward the lawyers, ready to entertain their inevitable objections, yet for a moment, even they remained silent. It was as though no one dared interrupt. The child adjusted herself on the chair, swinging her feet gently, and the microphone squealed faintly. She flinched but quickly steadied. Her gaze returned to Rex, unwavering, as though she were not addressing a court full of strangers but speaking directly to him. The silence in the room deepened. Every breath, every shuffle of paper seemed too loud. The air grew heavy with anticipation. What could a 3-year-old possibly say that might matter in a case like this? And yet, no one looked away. They couldn't. The scene unfolding was unlike anything the courtroom had ever witnessed. At that moment, it wasn't about the law or procedure or even guilt or innocence. It was about the raw, unfiltered truth waiting to come from the mouth of a child. And as the jurors, lawyers, reporters, and townspeople leaned forward, they all shared the same thought. Whatever happened next, it would be remembered forever. That was the power of innocence standing in a place built for judgment. The tiniest figure in the room was about to speak, and the entire courtroom hung on her words. For weeks, the courthouse had been at the center of a storm that no one in the small town could have predicted. It wasn't every day that a police dog stood at the heart of a legal battle, his reputation dissected by attorneys, his actions weighed as if he were human. The case drew crowds far beyond the town's borders. Television vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky, while reporters with microphones jostled for position on the courthouse steps. To some, it seemed absurd, a dog on trial. To others, it represented something far larger, the question of accountability in law enforcement. Rex, the German Shepherd, was no ordinary dog. Trained as a K-9 unit, he had served faithfully for years, credited with catching criminals, finding missing children, and preventing violence in countless situations. Yet one night, during what should have been a routine arrest, a suspect had been left bloodied after Rex lunged at him. The suspect's lawyer argued it was unnecessary force, the result of negligence, maybe even aggression. The police department defended Rex as a hero who only followed his handler's commands. The truth, however, seemed buried beneath a pile of testimonies, reports, and speculation. By the time the trial began, lines had already been drawn. Animal rights groups flooded the courthouse, demanding justice for the man who had been injured. Officers stood staunchly in support of Rex, their uniforms a sea of blue in the courtroom seats. Ordinary citizens filled every remaining spot, whispering heated debates. Some insisted Rex had done nothing wrong, that punishing him was absurd. Others argued that justice demanded even the strongest protectors be held to the same standard as anyone else. The prosecution painted Rex as unpredictable, a risk to public safety. They brought forward medical photos of the suspect's injuries, evidence of torn clothing and bite marks. The jury winced as the images flashed across the screen. Then came testimony from witnesses who claimed Rex had attacked without clear provocation. To many, it sounded convincing. But the defense countered with its own arsenal. They presented videos of Rex in action, sniffing out narcotics, locating missing persons, standing loyally by officers in tense situations. They told stories of how his training had saved lives, including officers themselves. They argued that Rex had not acted out of aggression but instinct, following commands in a situation that spiraled out of control. To punish him, they insisted, was to misunderstand the very nature of police dogs. In the midst of these arguments, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavy. Every day brought new debates. Neighbors stopped speaking to one another. Families argued over dinner tables. Social media exploded with hashtags, Justice for Rex and No Anim, above the law. The trial was no longer about one dog and one suspect. It had become a symbol of justice, responsibility, and loyalty. The judge, a seasoned man with decades of cases behind him, struggled to keep order. He banged his gavel more often than usual as lawyers bickered and crowds erupted in emotion. The case weighed heavily on him, for he knew whatever verdict was reached, half the town would feel betrayed. Yet his role was not to please but to ensure fairness. The jury, too, bore the burden. 12 ordinary citizens sat in silence as evidence piled up, their expressions unreadable. Some scribbled notes, others simply stared at Rex, who sat quietly beside his handler day after day. To them, he was no abstract figure. He was flesh and blood, calm yet powerful, his mere presence filling the courtroom with an aura of both reassurance and danger. Outside, the media stoked the flames. Evening broadcasts replayed footage of Rex walking into the courthouse, his leash taut in his handler's hand, his posture proud. Editorials debated the moral implications. Could a dog truly be judged by human law? Was he guilty, or merely a scapegoat for human error? The headlines grew bolder with each passing day, drawing more onlookers to the trial. Yet beneath the noise there were whispers of another story, one that few knew but that would soon change everything. A story about a little girl whose life had once been saved by the very dog now accused of violence. For her, Rex wasn't a defendant. He wasn't a controversy. He was her hero. That story, however, had yet to surface. For now, the courtroom remained consumed by debate, the air thick with tension. Each side fought with words, documents, and witnesses, but none could break the deadlock that seemed to loom over the case. And so the trial stretched on, a spectacle that gripped the town and refused to let go. When the judge announced that a new witness would be called, the murmurs began. People expected another expert, perhaps a police trainer or medical professional. No one imagined the creak of the courtroom door would reveal someone so small, so innocent, that her very presence would silence the room. That was still to come. But even before she spoke, the foundation of the trial had been laid. A town divided, a dog's fate uncertain, and a case that had spiraled into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It was not just about law, it was about loyalty, compassion, and the uneasy line between duty and blame. And at the heart of it all was Rex, the silent defendant whose calm eyes watched the world argue about his future. Long before the courtroom lights and the clicking cameras, there had been an ordinary afternoon that turned into an extraordinary memory. It was the kind of moment most people would forget in time, but for one family, and for Rex, it became a turning point. The little girl had been just a toddler then, even smaller than she was now, wandering outside the grocery store where her mother had been distracted with bags. Children often wandered. It wasn't unusual. But this time, her tiny feet carried her toward the street, toward the path of a car barreling down the road faster than it should have been. Witnesses remembered the scene vividly. They spoke of the panic that gripped them, of the way their voices caught in their throats as they saw what was about to happen. A child in the street, a car too close, too fast. There was no time to shout, no time to react. Her mother dropped her grocery bags, apples scattering across the sidewalk, her scream piercing the air. And then in an instant, Rex moved. The German Shepherd had been stationed nearby with his handler, waiting while officers managed a small disturbance in the area. His body was a coil of muscle, always alert, always ready. Without hesitation, he bolted forward, breaking from his handler's grip. His paws struck the pavement, his body cutting through the air with a speed that startled even those who had worked with him for years. Just as the car screeched its brakes, Rex's teeth caught the girl's jacket, tugging her back with a force far stronger than her fragile body could resist. The car roared past, its tires screeching, missing her by mere inches. The girl tumbled backward onto the grass, unharmed except for a small scratch on her knee. Her mother collapsed beside her, sobbing with relief. Bystanders gasped, some applauding, others whispering prayers of thanks. And Rex, he simply stood over the girl, chest heaving, his protective gaze fixed on her until his handler caught up and clipped the leash back onto his collar. That day became the story her family never stopped telling, the day a police dog had saved their daughter's life. They spoke of it at family gatherings, of how Rex's intervention had turned certain tragedy into a miracle. For the little girl, though too young to understand the magnitude, the memory remained imprinted in her heart. She remembered the dog's eyes, calm and steady, not frightening but kind. She remembered how safe she felt, even in that terrifying moment. As the months passed, the world forgot. News outlets never covered it, for no cameras had been there. Life moved on, but the bond between the child and Rex remained unshakable. Her family followed the trial with heavy hearts, horrified at the idea that the very dog who had saved their daughter could be condemned. When the opportunity arose for her to testify, they hesitated. Could a 3-year-old truly help? Would she even be allowed? But the girl herself was insistent. She had heard enough whispers, enough talk of Rex being dangerous. Her tiny voice, so often ignored in the bustle of adult conversations, had grown firm when she tugged at her mother's sleeve. "He's not bad," she had said. "He's my friend." Her parents wrestled with the decision, torn between shielding her from the spectacle of the trial and allowing her to speak her truth. In the end, they realized that no lawyer, no expert could offer what their daughter could, the perspective of someone who had been touched directly by Rex's loyalty. So here she was, sitting on the stand, gazing at him across the courtroom. Though she could not explain police protocols or training manuals, she carried something even more powerful, her story. A story of innocence meeting bravery. As the attorneys whispered among themselves, strategizing how to frame her testimony, the jurors watched her with quiet fascination. To them, she wasn't just another witness. She was the embodiment of what the case had been missing all along. For weeks, they had heard conflicting adult voices, all filtered through agendas and arguments. But this child carried no agenda. Her voice was unshaped by politics or legal definitions. She carried only memory, unfiltered and untainted. Rex's handler, seated just behind the dog, remembered that day vividly too. He had nearly lost control of Rex in that moment, shouting his name as the dog bolted forward. At first, he had feared the consequences. What if Rex had bitten the child? What if the maneuver had gone wrong? But when he saw the girl safely on the grass, his heart had pounded with pride. Rex had acted out of instinct, not training. It was his nature to protect. That nature was now on trial. The prosecution wanted to paint it as unpredictability, as a risk. The defense wanted to frame it as loyalty, as proof of his character. Yet no argument carried the weight of the girl's presence. She was living proof that Rex was more than just a tool of law enforcement. He was a guardian, capable of compassion and instinct beyond what manuals could describe. And so the bond between them, the bond forged in a split-second act of salvation, was about to shift the course of the trial. The jury had heard facts and figures, but now they were about to hear something different, something human, something raw. The girl's eyes stayed on Rex, and though she was too young to understand the full scope of the trial, she understood one thing clearly: he had once protected her, and now it was her turn to protect him. The courtroom hadn't yet realized it, but in that moment the balance began to tip. Not because of legal arguments or expert testimonies, but because of a simple truth: a child's connection to a dog who had saved her life. That truth, pure and undeniable, would soon echo through the room and leave it forever changed. The air in the courtroom was tense, heavy with expectation, as the little girl shifted nervously on the oversized chair. She was far too small for the witness stand. Her legs dangled above the floor, swinging back and forth as she clutched her teddy bear tightly. The bailiff, unsure how to handle a witness so young, had adjusted the microphone downward, but it still loomed awkwardly in front of her face. She stared at it for a moment, as though unsure if it might bite, then glanced toward her mother for reassurance. A murmur rippled across the benches. Some spectators smiled faintly at the sight of her innocence, but others shook their heads, whispering to one another. "This is a circus," one man muttered under his breath. "A toddler in court, what could she possibly know?" The prosecutor rose first, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "with all due respect, the admissibility of testimony from a child this young is questionable. She cannot understand the seriousness of these proceedings, nor can her memory be trusted for accuracy." His words were polished, precise, designed to strike at the heart of the judge's hesitation. The defense attorney countered immediately. "Your Honor, the jury has heard countless adults, officers, experts, even so-called specialists, each with their interpretations of Rex's behavior. But this child has no agenda. She has no motive to lie, no political or professional bias. All she has is her experience, and that experience is vital to understanding the truth." The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His eyes shifted from the attorneys to the little girl who sat quietly, staring at Rex. The German Shepherd hadn't moved. He sat tall, his ears slightly perked, his gaze locked on her as though the two shared an unspoken connection. The courtroom seemed to shrink in that moment, the noise of shuffling papers and whispered debates fading into silence. "Order," the judge said finally, his gavel rapping against the wood. "The court will allow the testimony." Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor frowned, muttering something to his aide, while the defense attorney allowed himself the faintest sigh of relief. The decision had been made. The smallest voice in the room would be heard. The girl shifted in her seat, her teddy bear's worn button eyes staring outward as if sharing the burden of the moment. Her mother gave her a reassuring nod, though her own hands trembled against her lap. "Sweetheart," the judge said gently, abandoning his usual stern tone, "can you tell us your name?" The girl blinked, then spoke softly, her words barely carried by the microphone. The jurors leaned forward, straining to catch her voice. One of them smiled despite herself, touched by the child's shyness. The judge nodded. "And do you know why you're here today?" Hesitated, then lifted her small hand to point toward Rex. "Because of him." The reaction was immediate. A wave of whispers swept through the room, some astonished, others skeptical. The prosecutor half rose from his seat, ready to object again, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "Let her continue." His eyes never left Rex. For her, the crowded room didn't exist. The jurors, the reporters, even the towering judge, all faded into the background. There was only her and the dog who had once saved her life. She gripped her teddy bear, her little knuckles whitening with the effort. The defense attorney said softly, careful not to intimidate her, "Can you tell us what you remember about Rex?" Before she could answer, the prosecutor rose once more, his tone clipped. "Objection, Your Honor. She is 3 years old. Any memory she claims to have is unreliable at best, fabricated at worst. We cannot." The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing him. "Objection overruled. The witness will be allowed to speak." The prosecutor sat down, visibly frustrated, though his eyes darted nervously toward the jury. He knew what was coming. He knew that innocence carried a weight far greater than polished arguments. Took a deep breath, as if gathering courage far beyond her years. She glanced briefly at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Then her gaze returned to Rex. The courtroom held its breath. For weeks, the trial had been defined by technicalities, by sterile debates about training manuals and handler commands. But now, for the first time, it felt like something real was about to be spoken, something human, something that could cut through the noise. The defense attorney stepped back, giving her space. The judge leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand. The jurors stilled, their pens hovering above their notepads. Even the reporters stopped scribbling for a moment, their cameras trained on the little girl. Small voice finally broke the silence. "He's a good dog." Her words were simple, almost too simple, but they carried a force that no one had anticipated. The air seemed to thicken, every sound swallowed by the weight of her declaration. The prosecutor slammed his pen against the table in frustration. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than sentiment." But the judge raised his hand again. "She will finish." Slip trembled, but she pressed on, her eyes shining with determination. "He saved me. He pulled me away when the car was coming. If he wasn't there, I would been gone." Her words rang through the courtroom like a bell. Some jurors covered their mouths. A reporter dropped his pen. The defense attorney lowered his gaze, overwhelmed by the power of her honesty. The moment stretched on, heavy with emotion. Rex, silent and still, blinked slowly, his dark eyes fixed on as though he understood every word. The courtroom had changed. Doubt still lingered, but fear had begun to crack, replaced by something stronger, the undeniable truth of a child's voice. And though the trial was far from over, everyone present understood that the balance had shifted. From that moment onward, the case was no longer about law or procedure. It was about loyalty, about innocence, and about the unshakable bond between a little girl and the dog who had once saved her life. The courtroom had fallen into an uneasy silence after testimony. The judge had called a recess, sensing that both jury and counsel needed time to process what had just unfolded. People shuffled out into the hallway, whispering to one another, their voices carrying a mix of awe, skepticism, and curiosity. But one thing was certain: the little girl's words had pierced the armor of doubt surrounding Rex. Remained in her mother's arms, clutching her teddy bear as though it were the only thing holding her together. Her small body trembled from the effort of speaking in front of so many strangers. Yet, despite her nerves, she kept glancing over at Rex. He sat calmly at the defense table, unmoving, his amber eyes never leaving her. It was as though he were silently reassuring her, "You did well. I'm here." In that moment, even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny there was something extraordinary about their bond. When court resumed, the prosecutor tried desperately to redirect the narrative. He called forward a series of experts, child psychologists, canine behaviorists, even a police lieutenant, to chip away at testimony. One psychologist argued that children often misremember events, that they confuse dreams with reality. Another suggested Story had been influenced by her mother, who might have unintentionally fed her the memory over time. The prosecutor emphasized these doubts, hammering them into the jury like nails. But each time the defense countered with quiet persistence. "Perhaps children can misremember," the defense attorney conceded. "But when fear and survival are involved, the mind holds on to truth with iron strength." Wasn't recounting a dream. She was recounting the moment Rex saved her life. Rex himself seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Whenever the prosecutor grew sharp, whenever the arguments grew heated, Rex would lift his head and gaze at the jury. His calmness stood in stark contrast to the storm of voices around him. It wasn't long before the defense requested permission for a live demonstration. "Your Honor," the attorney said, "we ask to show, not just tell, the jury what Rex is capable of. Words can be twisted, memories can be questioned, but actions speak for themselves." The prosecutor objected instantly. "This is a stunt, a circus act designed to manipulate emotions. We cannot allow theatrics in this court." But the judge, perhaps still moved by courage, leaned forward with measured calm. "Sometimes truth is found not in documents but in deeds. The request is granted. Proceed." The next day, the courtroom transformed into something more than of words. A small platform was set up, along with a few props, a ball, a rope, and even a dummy dressed in plain clothes. Reporters nearly tripped over one another trying to get a better view. The defense handler stepped forward. "Ladies and," he said, bowing slightly to the jury, "you've heard claims that Rex is dangerous, uncontrollable, a threat to those around him. Today, you'll see the truth." He gave a short command, and Rex immediately rose, his movements precise, his body language disciplined. The handler tossed the ball across the courtroom, and with a flick of his hand, commanded Rex to stay. The dog did not move, not even a twitch, despite the tempting object rolling a few feet away. Only when the handler gave the release command did Rex bolt forward, grab the ball, and return, placing it gently at his handler's feet. The jurors leaned forward. Some smiled, others scribbled notes, but all were watching intently. Next came the dummy demonstration. The handler staged a mock threat, instructing a volunteer officer to raise his voice and pretend to advance towards Mother, who had reluctantly agreed to participate. At once, Rex's demeanor shifted. He stood tall, ears forward, body tense, but he did not lunge. His eyes locked on the threat, waiting for the handler's signal. Only when the command was given did Rex sprint forward, tackling the dummy with trained precision, gripping but not harming, holding firm until the handler gave the release order. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The demonstration had been controlled, efficient, and safe. It showed not recklessness but remarkable discipline. The prosecutor tried to regain footing. "This proves nothing," he said, his voice rising. "This dog has been rehearsed for months. What happens when he is faced with real danger, real unpredictability?" The defense attorney stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "Perhaps the better question, ladies, is what happens when a little girl is faced with danger. Told you what happened. Rex didn't hesitate. He didn't question. He acted. And because of that, she is alive today." The words hung in the air, weaving themselves into the fabric of the jury's thoughts. That evening, outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, divided in opinion but united in fascination. Some carried signs that read "Justice for Rex," while others shouted that no animal should ever be trusted over human testimony. Reporters swarmed, broadcasting live, their voices trembling with excitement. The story had spread far beyond the city, beyond the state. It was now a national conversation. Watch from the window of her mother's apartment that night. Down below, the glow of streetlights illuminated the crowds chanting Rex's name. She pressed her teddy bear against the glass, her breath fogging the window pane. Beside her, Rex sat silently, his head resting against her small shoulder. She leaned against him in return, whispering, "Don't worry, boy. I'll tell them again if I have to. I'll never let them take you away." Rex closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, as though he understood every word. The next day in court, the prosecutor made one last attempt to discredit the bond between girl and dog. He grilled Smother on the stand, pressing her about the dangers of keeping such an animal near her child. "Isn't it true," he snapped, "that you fear what Rex might do in an uncontrolled situation?" But the mother's voice was steady. "The only thing I fear," she said, glancing at her daughter, "is a world where loyalty and love are put on trial." The courtroom went silent. The prosecutor faltered, his momentum slipping away. The defense seized the moment. "Ladies and of the jury," he said, turning toward them, "you have witnessed more than a case about a dog. You have witnessed proof that sometimes the forms of love and protection come from where we least expect them. The law is about truth, and the truth is clear. Rex is not a danger. He is a savior." The jurors exchanged glances, some nodding subtly. The energy had shifted. The walls of doubt were crumbling brick by brick, replaced by something stronger than logic: conviction. As the judge dismissed the court for the day, reached down to hug Rex tightly. "We're almost done," she whispered. "Just a little longer." And Rex, faithful as ever, wagged his tail, the sound echoing softly against the courtroom's marble floor like a heartbeat of hope. The tension in the courtroom had grown thicker with every passing day. What began as a case about a police dog's actions had turned into something larger, an unspoken trial of loyalty, justice, and the bond between humans and animals. The world was watching, and every juror seemed acutely aware that their decision would not just affect one dog, but would ripple across the country. Testimony still echoed through the minds of those present. The image of her small voice breaking the silence and her unwavering declaration, "He saved me," had become the anchor of the defense's argument. But the prosecution had not given up. They doubled down, calling forward witnesses to paint Rex as volatile, even dangerous. One officer recounted a training accident years earlier, when Rex had bitten through a padded sleeve with such force that the man wearing it stumbled and fell. Another described the way Rex growled during a high-pressure raid, arguing that his instincts could just as easily turn against an innocent bystander as a criminal. The prosecutor punctuated each testimony with sharp questions, repeating one phrase like a drumbeat. "Is this the kind of dog you want around children?" The defense countered calmly, pointing out that no civilian had ever been harmed by Rex in his years of service. They reminded the jury that controlled aggression in the line of duty was not evidence of danger, but proof of training. Most importantly, they returned again and again to story, the one piece of evidence untouched by politics or procedure. On the fifth day of deliberations, the judge announced that closing arguments would be heard the next morning. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters set up outside the courthouse long before dawn, their cameras trained on the doors, their voices eager to narrate every twist. Crowds swelled, chanting slogans, holding signs with pictures of Rex and demanding justice. Inside, Rex lay quietly by his handler's side, his breathing slow and steady. He didn't know the words being spoken, didn't understand the weight pressing down on the humans around him. What he did know, in that way only dogs can, was that the little girl who smelled of vanilla cookies and cradled a teddy bear was frightened, and that it was his job to protect her. That night couldn't sleep. She tossed beneath her blanket, her teddy clutched to her chest. Her mother stroked her hair, whispering reassurances, but the child's mind kept replaying what she'd heard in court. Dangerous, uncontrollable, a threat. She sat up suddenly, her small voice breaking the stillness. "Mommy, why do they keep saying he's bad?" she asked. Her mother hesitated, caught between truth and comfort. Finally, she said softly, "Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand. Sometimes they think protecting means hurting. But you know better, don't you?" Nodded, though her lip trembled. She turned toward the corner of the room where Rex lay, his golden eyes half open, watching her. "He's good," she whispered firmly. "I'll tell them again tomorrow if I have to." The next morning, the courtroom overflowed with people. Reporters jostled for space, sketch artists sharpened pencils, and spectators leaned forward in their seats. The air buzzed with electricity, the kind that prickles the skin before a storm. The prosecutor rose first for his closing statement. He spoke with conviction, his words sharp as knives. He painted pictures of chaos. What if Rex snapped during a school visit? What if he mistook a child's playful tug for aggression? "We cannot," he declared, slamming his palm on the podium, "gamble with human lives in the hope that instinct will always bend in our favor. Rex is not a villain, but neither is he a hero. He is an unpredictable weapon, and weapons do not belong in our neighborhoods." He ended with a final blow. One day his bite will not land on a sleeve or a dummy, it will land on flesh, and by then it will be too late. The courtroom was silent as he sat down, his words lingering in the air like smoke. Then the defense attorney rose, his tone quiet at first, forcing the room to lean in. "Weapons destroy," he said. "Rex protects." He walked slowly across the courtroom, pausing beside the jury box. "We've heard words meant to frighten us, but fear is not truth. Truth is what gave you. Truth is what Rex demonstrated before your very eyes." He gestured toward Rex, who sat calmly, tail brushing against the marble floor. "This is not an unpredictable beast. This is a dog who risked his life to save a child he had never met. This is a partner who has served faithfully, who has shown restraint, loyalty, and courage again and again. Are we to condemn him for the very instincts that saved lives?" His voice grew stronger, his words carrying the weight of conviction. "The law is meant to protect the innocent. If Rex stands condemned, then the law will have failed not only him but every child who deserves the kind of protection he offers." At that he turned back toward, she clutched her teddy bear, her eyes wide but unflinching. "Sometimes," the attorney said softly, "justice is not found in thick books or long speeches. Sometimes it's found in the smallest voice. You heard that voice this week. You heard a child speak truth with more courage than most adults, and you saw how Rex looked at her. Ask yourselves, does danger look like that, or does love?" The silence that followed was deafening. The jury retired to deliberate. Hours passed, the weight of the decision pressing down on every person in the building. Reporters speculated wildly. The crowd outside chanted louder, and inside sat with her head against Rex's fur, whispering promises only he could hear. As dusk fell, the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled once again, hearts pounding in anticipation. The judge took her seat, her gavel striking once. "Members of the jury, have you reached a decision?" The foreman stood, a folded paper trembling slightly in his hand. "We have, Your Honor." His mother gripped her daughter's hand. The defense attorney exhaled, shoulders tense. Rex sat quietly, unaware that his fate balanced on the edge of a single sentence. And as the foreman unfolded the paper and prepared to speak, the entire room leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. The verdict was seconds away. The air inside the courtroom was so heavy that it seemed even the chandeliers above had gone still, their crystals refraining from their usual faint jingle. The foreman's hands trembled as he held the verdict slip. He cleared his throat once, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, and the sound echoed like a cannon in the hushed chamber. Clung to her mother's sleeve, her teddy bear pressed tightly against her chest. Her little legs swung nervously beneath the bench, too short to touch the floor. She didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening, but she understood enough. They were about to decide if her friend would stay or be taken away. Rex sat beside his handler, still as stone, yet his ears twitched as though he could sense the waves of fear and anticipation flowing through the room. The judge adjusted her glasses, her face composed but her eyes betraying the strain of days of testimony. "Please read the verdict," she instructed. The foreman's voice wavered at first, then steadied as he began. "On the matter of whether Rex, a K-9 unit of the city police department, is to be deemed a danger to the public, we, the jury, find." He paused and the silence was unbearable. Some spectators closed their eyes. Reporters held their pens midair, their notes unfinished. Even the prosecutor, so sure of his case, leaned forward, lips parted in quiet suspense. "Not guilty." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted across the courtroom, followed by a ripple of whispers that quickly swelled into applause. Cameras flashed, their bright lights reflecting off the polished wooden panels. His mother let out a sob of relief, wrapping both arms around her daughter. Overcome with joy, cried out, "He can stay, he can stay," before burying her face into her mother's shoulder. Rex, sensing the surge of emotion, wagged his tail for the first time in days. The handler gave him a gentle pat, his usually stoic face breaking into a broad smile. The prosecutor sat back heavily in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes darkened with defeat. He had expected resistance, but he had not anticipated the sheer force of human emotion that had brought into the courtroom. The defense attorney, on the other hand, clasped his hands together and whispered, "Thank you," as though addressing something greater than the jury itself. The judge struck her gavel twice, calling for order, but even she couldn't entirely hide the faint upward curve of her lips. "The jury has spoken," she said firmly. "Rex will remain in service. This court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel was drowned out by cheers. Some people stood, clapping loudly, others wiped away tears. For a moment, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of conflict, but of unity. It was as though everyone understood they had just witnessed something historic, not merely a trial, but a testament to the enduring connection between a child and her protector. Wriggled free from her mother's arms and darted toward Rex. Her mother called after her, but she was already halfway across the aisle. Reporters snapped photos furiously as the little girl threw her arms around the German shepherd's neck. Rex lowered his head, pressing his snout gently against her hair, his body language radiating calm devotion. The handler didn't pull him back. He simply let the moment unfold, knowing it was precisely this bond that had saved Rex's life. The jury had not only heard about it, they had seen it, felt it. Now, the entire world was seeing it too. Outside the courthouse, the scene was no less electric. The crowd erupted when word of the verdict spread. Chants of "Justice for Rex" turned into cheers of victory. Television crews scrambled to broadcast the outcome live, their voices straining above the roar of celebration. Cars honked, flags waved, and people hugged strangers as though they had all shared in the triumph. But not everyone was pleased. Opponents shook their heads, muttering about precedent and risk. A small cluster of protesters raised their signs higher, warning of future tragedies. Yet their voices were drowned in the swell of joy that surged like a tidal wave through the streets. Back inside, the defense attorney escorted and her mother through a side exit to avoid the chaos of reporters. Rex walked at their side, regal and calm, his paws clicking softly against the tiled floor. Still clutching her teddy bear, reached out her tiny hand and rested it on Rex's back. She looked up at her mother, her face glowing. "See, I told you," she said proudly. "He's good." Her mother bent down, tears shimmering in her eyes, and kissed her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, you were right all along." The attorney, walking just ahead, glanced back at them and whispered, "Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted. Sometimes it only needs to be spoken once by the right voice." For the rest of that evening, Rex remained the center of attention. The police department released a statement praising the jury's decision, assuring the public that Rex would continue his service but with additional safeguards to ease concerns. His handler, interviewed by reporters, stood firm. "Rex isn't just a dog. He's a partner, a protector, and a hero. Today, justice recognized that." As for she was lifted onto her mother's shoulders as the crowd outside dispersed. She waved to the cameras, grinning ear to ear, unaware of how profoundly her small voice had changed the course of events. To her, it was simple. She had spoken the truth, and they had listened. That night back at home, knelt beside Rex as he curled up on the living room rug. She whispered into his ear, "I told them you were my friend, and now everybody knows." Rex exhaled, the deep sigh of a dog at peace, and rested his head against her knee. The trial had ended. The verdict had been delivered, but the story of Rexon was far from over. For what began as a battle in court was now blossoming into something greater, a legacy that would inspire others for years to come. And though the world outside buzzed with analysis, debates, and headlines, inside that quiet home, all that mattered was the steady rhythm of a child's laughter and the soft thump of a dog's tail against the floor. The storm had passed. The bond had prevailed. The morning after the verdict, the city woke to a different kind of dawn. The courthouse that had once been a fortress of tension now stood quiet, its steps littered only with yesterday's discarded coffee cups and half-torn protest signs. Yet the world beyond those steps was anything but calm. Newspapers splashed Rex's name across their front pages. Talk shows dissected every detail of the trial. And social media exploded with images of a little girl hugging a police dog in a courtroom where history had just been written. Blissfully unaware of the scale of her impact, sat at her kitchen table eating cereal. Her teddy bear sat propped up beside her, as though keeping watch over her bowl of milk and Cheerios. Her mother flipped through the morning paper, her eyes wide as she read column after column praising bravery. She looked up from the paper and smiled at her daughter. "Do you know what they're calling you?" she asked softly. Tilted her head, spoon halfway to her mouth. "What?" "A hero," her mother said, her voice catching slightly. Giggled, shaking her head. "No, Rex is the hero. I just told the truth." That simple statement spread further than any headline. Later that day, a reporter quoted it during a live broadcast, and it quickly went viral. "I just told the truth." It became a rallying cry, a reminder that sometimes the wisdom came from the mouths of children. Meanwhile, Rex was officially reinstated into the K-9 unit, though his role shifted subtly. The police chief, realizing the immense public attention, announced that Rex would serve not only in the field but also as an ambassador, a symbol of trust between law enforcement and the community. School visits, charity events, and public demonstrations began filling his schedule. Wherever Rex went, people gathered to see him, children eager to pat his head, parents grateful for the chance to shake the paw of a dog who had reminded the world what loyalty truly meant. The bond between and Rex grew stronger with each passing day. On weekends, the handler would bring Rex by the family's home, would run to the door at the sound of his paws on the porch, throwing her arms around him before he'd even stepped inside. They played in the backyard, laughter echoing through the neighborhood as Rex chased Bubbles, never popping them, only nudging them gently with his nose. But beyond the laughter, there was healing. Parents, still haunted by that day outside the grocery store when a car nearly stole their daughter's life, found peace in Rex's presence. They often sat on the porch, coffee mugs in hand, watching and Rex together, marveling at the way the dog seemed to know exactly when she needed comfort and when she wanted play. The trial's impact reached far beyond their family. Across the country, police departments their K-9 programs, not just for safety, but for humanity. Training manuals began to include sections on community engagement, inspired by the idea that dogs like Rex weren't just tools, they were partners who could bridge the gap between law enforcement and civilians. Nonprofits sprang up, dedicated to supporting retired K-9 officers, ensuring they received the care and respect they deserved after service. Donations poured in, often accompanied by notes that read simply, "For Rex." And she grew accustomed to being recognized. Sometimes strangers would stop her mother in the grocery store, crouching down to tell how brave she was, would usually smile shyly, then point at Rex if he happened to be with them. "He's the brave one," she'd say, her voice soft but firm. One spring afternoon, months after the verdict, preschool invited Rex and his handler to visit. The classroom buzzed with excitement as the children sat cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide as Rex padded into the room, stood proudly beside him, introducing him as though she were his official spokesperson. "This is Rex," she told her classmates. "He saves people, but mostly he's my friend." The teacher, moved to tears, later wrote a letter to his mother. "Your daughter reminded all of us today," she wrote, "that friendship and loyalty are lessons no textbook can teach. Rex may wear a badge, but it is courage that gave him his voice." Years later, when was old enough to fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened, she would look back on the trial not as a frightening chapter, but as the beginning of something bigger. She would read about how laws had shifted, how policies had changed, and how children in classrooms across the country learned about the little girl who stood up for a dog in court. She would realize then that her small voice had echoed louder than she could have ever imagined. But for now, in those tender years, didn't need legacy or recognition. She only needed Rex. She only needed the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers and the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. On quiet evenings, after the reporters stopped calling and the cameras moved on, would curl up beside Rex on the rug. She'd whisper her secrets into his ear, her words tumbling out in the way only children could confide. And Rex would listen, patient and calm, his eyes soft with a wisdom older than his years. The trial had ended with a verdict, but the story had ended with something far greater, a promise. A promise that bravery comes in all sizes, a promise that loyalty deserves to be honored, and above all, a promise that love, whether between people or between a child and her dog, has the power to silence even the loudest courtroom. As drifted to sleep one night, Rex shifted closer, his nose nudging her teddy bear until it rested snugly beneath her chin. Her breathing slowed, her small hand clutching his fur. The world outside buzzed with headlines, but inside that quiet home there was only peace. And in that peace lived a story that would never fade, a story not of laws or verdicts, but of a little girl who stood for the truth and the dog who stood for her. Forever,